Okay, chapter 8. Over the next couple of days, Mrs. Stroud had a lot to say to Joseph about violating rules and being mature and understanding boundaries. And what was he thinking anyway? And didn't he realize and stuff? And over the next couple of days, Mr. Canton had a lot to say to Joseph about missing school and about responsibilities and being truant and meeting expectations. And who did he think he was? And didn't he get it that rules are for everybody and stuff? We started walking to school again, since Joseph really didn't want to hear the whole lot that Mr. Haskell probably had to say too. My father said that was all right. What Joseph did want to hear, though, was anything about Jupiter. And the librarian kept her promise. She wrote to Joseph every week. All through the rest of January and into February, the letters came, mostly on Mondays, and sometimes Joseph would read a little bit to us, or show the new picture, but mostly he kept them to himself, which my father said was all right too. And you know what? At night now, I wasn't hearing anything from Stone Mountain. It was still dark when we walked to school in the morning, but it was lighter coming home and not as cold. Sometimes we'd have snowball fights by Old First Congregational, and Joseph would defend from behind the bridge outside, or sometimes we just lob snowballs at the bell. At home, sugaring time would come soon, and already we'd carry the pails and the taps and the tubing down from the barn loft and begun to wash them out. Joseph and I were splitting wood. He was getting really good, and piling it beside the sugaring house. And in the small barn, Quintus Sertorius had smelled February, and already he was excited. He knew he'd be dragging the sled through the woods soon, and after a winter of doing not very much, he was ready to get out. Things were changing for Joseph at school. He wasn't doing fifth period office duty anymore, since Mr. Delaney had nominated him for Math Olympiad in April, so fifth period he was tutoring Joseph in trigonometry. No kidding, trigonometry. In PE, Coach Switek put Joseph in charge of his own squad of kids who wanted to go out for track and field in the spring. Joseph worked them in the field stuff, high jump and broad jump, and even pole vault. And he was so good that no one minded that a kid was coaching them. Except I don't think Mr. Canton liked it. Once he came to class and did a lot of pointing at Joseph, who was showing John Wall and Danny Nations in his earbuds how to pile up the high jump pads. But Coach Switek said something I think the class wasn't supposed to hear, and Mr. Canton left pretty quickly. I wondered if Joseph was supposed to hear it though, and Mrs. Holloway in language arts was calling on him a lot. I think because she saw Joseph reading Walden. She asked him if he liked it, and he said he'd already read it once and he was reading it again. And she asked if he had read her favorite Thoreau book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. And he said, A week on the what? And she took him to the library and they checked it out together. You know how teachers are. If they get you to take out a book, they love to. They're yours for life. Mm-hmm. In the third week of February, on Monday, after Joseph finished reading the letter from the librarian that was waiting for him, and it was a good one, you could tell, we went out with my father and tapped 36 trees. These pails will fill pretty quickly, he said. I don't know what we ever did without you, Joseph. He just said it like that, just like that. But after he said it, Joseph looked at him. Think we can put in another 24 tomorrow, my father said. Someday Jupiter would love to do this, said Joseph. Now my father looked at him. Yes, she will, he finally said. Really? Said Joseph. Let's go back up to the house, said my father. That night, my father and mother went into their room right after supper. They were in there for a long time. I think they might have made a phone call or two. Have I told you about the first time Maddie and I danced, said Joseph. Yes, I said to him. It was great, he said. I know, I told him. It really was, he said. And then he looked down the hall toward my parents' room and went out to be with Rosie, smiling. I had lost count. The night stayed cold and the days warmed up and the sap flowed like it had never flowed before. And my father almost laughed at the number of pails that we brought in every day. We could hardly wait to come home from school. Joseph said it was almost worth taking the school bus for, but not quite. So we half ran most of the way in the light that slanted against us, and it began to feel as if it had always been like this, like it would always be like this, until that day we came home and there was a new clean white pickup by the barn running with no one inside and no one around, and Joseph slowed and stopped and he looked at me and he said, Jackie, go into the big barn. Why? I asked him. Just do it, okay? He gave me his books, looked at the pickup again, and went inside. I went into the barn, put our books down on the grain bins, and went to rub Rosie's rump, even though she'd rather have Joseph do it. I waited. I rubbed Dahlia's rump, but she doesn't care who rubs her rump. She just kept chewing. Waited. Went back out to the grain bins, and then I heard my father holler, "No!" And then again I heard, "No!" That was all I needed. Here's what I saw when I slammed in the kitchen less than 1 second later. My mother, standing beside Joseph with her hands on his shoulders. Joseph crying, his face all wet. My father standing in front of the two of them. Joseph's father standing by the door, so close I almost ran into his back. And in his hand, I saw it just for a second, the blue metal of a gun. Then Joseph's father had his arm around my chest and he dragged me against him, and my father took a step toward us, and Joseph's father jerked me tight and said, "Stop." And my father did. I could smell his father, the stink of sweat, the sick sweet of what he had been drinking. "This changes things," he said. No one spoke. "This changes things," he said again. He leaned toward my father. "It sure does." "All I want is my boy," he shook me. "Same as you. We both want what's best for our boys," said my father. I could tell he was trying to sound calm, but he wasn't. "We both want what's best, but this isn't the way to do it." "It's my way," said Joseph's father. And then Joseph, from somewhere deep in his gut, screamed, "You sold her! You freaking sold her!" "I made an arrangement," Joseph's father said. "You weren't going to get her, and we needed a new truck. I'm not a do-good fool like them." He pointed to my parents. Joseph screamed again, not even words this time. He screamed at his father like something had ripped deep inside of him. Then suddenly, he pulled away from my mother, and if my father hadn't grabbed him, he would have come at us. My father held Joseph from behind, held him as he cried and he sobbed, held him as he went to the floor. And when Joseph sobbed into silence, his father said, "Done now, kid?" Joseph looked at him. "Get in the truck." Joseph stood up. My father held his arm. "In the truck," his father said again. My father pulled Joseph behind him. "You're going to get in your truck," my father said. "You're going to let my boy go, and you're going to get in your truck, and this is going to end." But Joseph's father held me even tighter. "You think you're in charge here," he said. He held his hand out and showed the gun, then placed it against my side. A cry jolted from my mother. I think it was when I was about to wet my pants. "Give me my boy and we'll be gone." My father said, "And how far do you think you're going to get? 10 miles? 15? Maybe all the way to the state border? But they'll be watching for you there. Trucks like yours, they'll find you easy," my father said. "So maybe I'll take them both," said Joseph's father. "How would you like that? I'll take my kid and yours for insurance." "No," said Joseph. "No, Dad, I'm coming. Let's just go." He came out from behind my father. "Let's go, Dad. Leave him here. Let's leave them all here and go." His father's arm around me relaxed a little. Joseph came up to us slowly. "Let's go," he said, almost whispered. I felt the gun move away from my side. Joseph took my arm and pulled me away from his father. "Dad, let's go." He put his hand on my back and nudged me toward my father. And Joseph took his father's arm. "Come on." And they went through the door and outside. "Let's go." The door closed. My father ran to the store. My father ran to the phone. My mother ran to me. I watched through the window as Joseph and his father got into the pickup. The door slammed and the pickup whipped around and away. Not before Joseph looked back one more time and he saw me, and then he was gone. They weren't 10 seconds out of the yard before my father had the police on the phone. Here's what we figure happened next. Joseph's father was probably driving a whole lot faster than he could handle. Mr. Canton was driving out of school, and he was about to turn right by Old First Congregational when he saw the white pickup truck coming toward him. He braked and skidded on the ice into the middle of the road. Joseph's father hit him square. He jammed Mr. Canton's car over the embankment and onto some trees, which kept it from rolling over completely. Then he turned in front of Old First Congregational. He turned through the bridge out sign, right onto Alliance Bridge. They didn't even make it halfway over the bridge. The rotted timbers collapsed and the pickup fell between the grinders, and then it went through the ice and it was gone. By the time Mr. Canton got out of his car and ran to the bridge, he couldn't see a thing in the black water. Neither could the police later. No one could see a thing. They didn't get the pickup out of the river for 2 days. My father wouldn't let me go down there, but he went. He said Mr. Canton opened the frozen door on Joseph's side, but it was my father who carried Joseph out of the truck. That's all he would tell me. The funeral service for Joseph was 3 days later. Mr. Delaney was there, Mr. Canton, Mrs. Holloway, Coach Switek, who cried the whole time, my mother and my father. The librarian who sat in the back, Pastor Greenlee from the Baptist Church outside of Lewiston, Mrs. Stroud, Ernie Hupfer, John Wall, Danny Nations, but no earbuds. That was all. We met in a side chapel of New First Congregational because there were so few of us. We didn't sing, but Mrs. Ballou played the organ quietly through about everything. Reverend Ballou asked if anyone had anything they'd like to say, and my father looked at me, but I didn't want to say anything in front of people. I might, So Reverend Ballou read some verses and talked about them, and he said something about angels, and he stopped for a little bit, and then he said really quietly, but where the hell were they? And then we prayed a long time. Afterward, we went out to the cemetery on Lower Gore, where the Hurd grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents are buried. Mr. Canton and Mr. Delaney and my father and we held the ropes that lowered Joseph into our family, besides the high white pines. Then Reverend Ballou prayed again, and he said that Joseph had put himself in danger to save others. And then he said, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And that's when I started crying like a kindergarten kid in front of everyone, crying because Joseph wasn't just my friend. I had his back and he had mine. That's what greater love is. One more chapter.